Have you ever smiled over champagne, watching your brother dismantle your career before 200 elite guests I have? While the room laughed at his cruel joke, he remained completely unaware that the phone in my purse had just buzzed. It was a message powerful enough to incinerate his entire empire. Everyone assumed I was passively enduring the public humiliation. In reality, I was simply counting down the seconds until the bomb detonated. Welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories, my wonderful listeners. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and paying our dedicated team. If you enjoy today's story and want to help us cover our living expenses so we can continue creating for you, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. My name is Sabrina Harper, and this is my story. I am 34 years old, an urban planning architect, and I was currently suffocating in the middle of the most exclusive golf club in Seattle. The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive gardenias, and the unmistakable, metallic stench of generational wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the 200 elite guests who had gathered to celebrate my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. On the surface, it was a flawless tableau of a successful, loving American family. Beneath the imported silk tablecloths and the polite clinking of baccarat crystal, however, the rot was deep, systemic, and utterly exhausting. At the front of the room, standing confidently on a mahogany stage, was my older brother, Julian Harper. He was the undisputed golden child of the Harper dynasty, currently reigning as the director of development for a massive corporate real estate conglomerate. He tapped the microphone. The sharp screech of feedback silenced the low hum of aristocratic chatter. Julian adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit and flashed his trademark predatory smile. The exact same smile that had charmed strict zoning boards and devastated vulnerable rival firms for over a decade. "Mom, Dad," Julian began, raising his flute of vintage champagne high into the air. 35 years. You have built a legacy of excellence. You have built a legacy of absolute winners. He paused, his dark eyes scanning the attentive crowd until they locked directly onto me. I stood near a massive ice sculpture, feeling a sudden, chilling shift in the room's atmosphere. I knew that look. It was the look he gave right before he went in for the kill. Of course, maintaining that kind of family legacy requires actual, ruthless ambition. Julian continued, his voice echoing sharply through the silent hall. He took a slow, theatrical step forward, commanding the space like a seasoned actor. Take my dear little sister, Sabrina, for example. She is currently playing around with her little eco-housing project over at Vanguard Horizon Designs. It is cute, really, but let us be painfully honest with ourselves tonight. Designing green rooftops and worrying about sustainable drainage is just a charity game for those incompetent at making real money. While some of us are out here building the skyline of tomorrow, others are just planting expensive gardens and hoping for a pat on the back. The silence that followed his words was suffocating. Then, the laughter started. It was not a booming, genuine roar, but a synchronized, polite, and terribly cruel chuckling from the city's financial elite. They were laughing to appease the man with the deepest pockets. I watched the micro-expressions ripple across the faces of my so-called family friends. I saw the slightly raised eyebrows, the mocking, tight-lipped smirks, and the fleeting, pitying glances darting my way before quickly looking away. I shifted my gaze to my parents. They were seated at the center of the head table, bathed in the bright spotlight. Did they stand up? Did they demand respect for their daughter? My mother suddenly found her linen napkin incredibly fascinating, carefully smoothing out invisible wrinkles with her manicured fingers. My father took a long, deliberate sip of his red wine, his eyes fixed firmly on the elaborate floral centerpiece. They simply looked away, choosing the path of least resistance. They were continuing to enable Julian's arrogance and cruelty, just as they had done every single day for the past 30 years. To them, Julian's massive bank account excused his toxic behavior, and my quiet, steady dedication to public infrastructure was merely an unfortunate embarrassment. I felt the familiar burning sensation in the back of my throat, the ingrained childhood instinct to shrink, to hide, to apologize for simply existing in his shadow. But before the heat could rise to my cheeks, a sharp, rhythmic vibration pulsed against my hip. My phone was buzzing inside my evening clutch. Under the cover of the crowd's fading laughter, I unclasped the purse and slipped the device out. The glowing screen illuminated my palm. It was an urgent, encrypted email from Victoria Vance, the famously ruthless and impartial Urban Planning Commissioner for the state of Washington. I tapped the message open. The words on the screen were stark, clinical, and completely devastating. The email confirmed a seismic, world-altering shift in reality. Julian's proposed multi-billion-dollar tech hub complex, the very project he had built his entire arrogant persona upon, had just been officially stripped of all its permits due to massive, undeniable compliance violations. But the commissioner did not stop there. The second paragraph clearly stated that my sustainable design proposal, the exact project Julian was currently mocking in front of 200 people, had just been officially selected to receive the city's massive funding package. I blinked. I read the glowing words a second time, and then a third. The power dynamic of my entire existence had completely inverted in the span of 10 seconds. Julian was still standing proudly on the stage, soaking in the sycophantic applause, basking in the absolute illusion of his own invincibility. A weaker sister would have thrown her drink in his face, screamed about the unfairness of it all, or simply run crying out of the heavy double doors. I did none of those things. I slowly locked my phone screen and slipped it back into the dark confines of my clutch. I raised my flute of champagne, catching the chandelier's bright light in the bubbling golden liquid. I took a long, deliberate sip, letting the crisp, cold wine wash away the bitter, lingering taste of 30 years of subjugation. I swallowed, lowered the delicate glass, and smiled. I looked directly into my brother's eyes from across the crowded room. My smile was serene, absolute, and terrifyingly calm. I decided right then and there to keep my mouth entirely shut. I was going to let him enjoy his fleeting golden moment. I was going to let him keep talking, keep boasting, and keep digging his own grave deeper and deeper into the night. Just 72 hours earlier, the battle lines had been drawn not in a suffocating ballroom, but under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the municipal council chambers. I had stood alone before the zoning board, defending the blueprints of Vanguard Horizon Designs. My presentation was not a display of corporate ego, but a meticulous, data-driven masterclass in sustainable urban planning. I walked the council through advanced rainwater harvesting systems, solar-paneled green roofs, and energy optimization grids designed to serve the working-class community for an entire century. It was an arduous fight. The Seattle real estate market is a brutal, blood-soaked arena where long-term sustainability is routinely slaughtered on the altar of immediate quarterly profits. My design was mathematically bulletproof, but it lacked the blinding, seductive glare of instant wealth. My direct competitor for the city's largest developmental grant of the decade was, inevitably, my own flesh and blood. Julian had countered my proposal with a glittering, hyper-aggressive vision of a luxury tech utopia. His blueprints were an assault of towering glass spires, high-end commercial zoning, and promises of astronomical short-term tax revenues. What his sleek, three-dimensional models conveniently obscured was the catastrophic strain his mega-complex would place on the city's aging power grid. He completely bypassed fundamental environmental safety standards, opting instead to sell the city council a shiny, toxic mirage that would crumble within 20 years. After the grueling hearings concluded, the grand, marble-floored lobby of the city hall had transformed into a makeshift coliseum. I was quietly packing my architectural blueprints into my leather case when Julian approached. He did not come alone. He was flanked by a group of heavy-hitting private investors, silver-haired men whose custom-tailored suits cost more than my entire firm's monthly operating budget. Julian had deliberately positioned himself so his voice would carry, echoing sharply off the high ceiling so everyone in our immediate influential radius could hear his verdict. "It is an incredibly sweet little presentation. Sabrina," Julian had sneered, casually straightening his imported silk tie. "But you are trying to sell a community garden to a city that desperately needs a gold mine. You need to grow up and learn how the real world actually operates. Ethics have no place on a balance sheet. When you finally figure that out, maybe I will let you design the landscaping for my commercial lobbies." The circle of investors had chuckled in unison, clapping him on the shoulder like a conquering hero. He walked away, projecting the absolute aura of an untouchable king. But what those wealthy investors did not know, what my parents willfully chose to ignore, and what I had only recently discovered, was the intensely precarious reality of Julian's corporate throne. Behind the arrogant smirks and the expensive dinners, my brother was drowning. His entire position as director of development at the conglomerate, along with a multi-million-dollar end-of-year bonus, was completely tethered to winning this exact municipal contract by any means necessary. His department had been bleeding cash for 3 consecutive quarters. He had essentially mortgaged his entire professional existence on securing this city funding. If he lost this bid, the board of directors would devour him alive. Driven by that sheer, hidden desperation, Julian had made a fatal miscalculation. He had fundamentally underestimated Victoria Vance. The commissioner was notorious throughout Washington state for being a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly impartial force of nature. She did not care about flashy holographic models, and she was entirely immune to the arrogant charm of a Harper. Highly suspicious of the impossibly high profit margins Julian had promised the city, Vance had secretly ordered an independent forensic audit of both our projects over the past 48 hours. The results of that audit, which were currently resting silently in my evening purse, were absolute and damning. The investigation proved that every single data point, energy projection, and cost analysis Vanguard Horizon Designs had submitted was 100% authentic. We had underpromised and overdelivered. In stark contrast, Julian's projected figures were exposed as a complete financial hallucination. He had manipulated the structural risk assessments, buried the long-term infrastructural costs in dummy shell accounts, and entirely fabricated his sustainability metrics. He had built a towering castle of sand, and Victoria Vance had just let the cold tide roll in. The memory dissolved abruptly as a tuxedo-clad waiter brushed past my shoulder, bringing me crashing back to the stifling reality of my parents' anniversary party. The polite applause from Julian's condescending speech was finally dying down. I stood perfectly still beside the melting ice sculpture, observing him as he descended the mahogany stage. He immediately launched himself into the thick of the crowd, warmly shaking hands with powerful local politicians, kissing the powdered cheeks of wealthy socialites, and confidently accepting premature congratulations for a municipal victory he believed was already his. It was a fascinating, almost tragic psychological study. I watched my older brother expertly network and charm the room, entirely oblivious to the terrifying truth. He was currently spending a professional reputation that had already been vaporized. He was a corporate ghost parading in a tailored suit, laughing and drinking, completely unaware that his heart had already stopped beating. The ambient mood in the grand ballroom shifted as a 12-piece jazz band struck up a lively, swinging melody. The heavy velvet curtains framing the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to absorb the rich notes, while the polished parquet floor quickly filled with swaying couples. The party was transitioning into its most festive phase, a dizzying whirlwind of expensive perfume and swirling silk. I remained anchored to my secluded spot by the ice sculpture, observing the chaotic choreography of wealth. It did not take long for the undisputed star of the evening to find me. Julian broke away from a circle of adoring socialites and made a deliberate, winding path toward my corner. The predatory confidence in his stride was unmistakable. He stopped just inches away, invading my personal space, his cologne sharp and suffocating. You look incredibly isolated over here, Sabrina, Julian murmured, keeping his voice perfectly modulated so no passing guest could hear the venom beneath his velvet tone. Brooding does not suit you. It makes you look bitter. I kept my expression entirely neutral, meeting his gaze without flinching. I am just enjoying the music, Julian. He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. Right. Listen, when your little eco startup inevitably files for bankruptcy next month, do not say your big brother never looked out for you. I will be needing a new executive assistant, someone to manage my calendar, order my coffee, and perhaps pick up my dry cleaning. The starting salary is likely double what you make now. Think about it. He patted my shoulder condescendingly, a physical assertion of his perceived dominance, before turning his back to return to his audience. Exactly as his hand left my arm, a specialized, rhythmic vibration pulsed against my thigh. This was not an email notification. It was the distinct, encrypted alert pattern from Matteo, the chief legal counsel and my most trusted colleague at Vanguard Horizon Designs. I turned my body slightly toward the wall, shielding the screen from any wandering eyes, and opened the secure application. Matteo had sent a single, heavily encrypted file folder. The attached text read, "We caught him. Look at the transaction logs." My heart slammed against my ribs as I opened the documents. The first image was a screenshot of a wire transfer, $50,000 routed from one of Julian's untraceable shell corporations to an offshore account. The second document was a chain of deleted emails, recently recovered by Matteo's forensic contacts. The recipient was a low-level, easily corruptible administrative clerk working deep within the municipal zoning office. The sheer scale of the betrayal crystallized on my glowing screen. Julian had not merely relied on his fabricated, hyperinflated financial projections to win the city contract. He had actively paid a government employee to secretly insert critical structural flaws into the digital copies of Vanguard Horizon Design's blueprints. It was a calculated criminal act of sabotage designed to trigger an automatic disqualification of my firm based on fraudulent safety violations. A sharp, involuntary shudder ripped down my spine, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. The psychological landscape of our entire sibling rivalry violently reconfigured itself in my mind. For 30 years, I had believed Julian looked down on me with genuine, unadulterated contempt. I thought he viewed me as a pathetic, insignificant insect, but you do not orchestrate a complex, high-risk felony to crush an insect. You only go to those extreme, illegal lengths when you are facing a genuine threat. The bitter, intoxicating truth flooded my veins. Beneath the tailored Italian suits, the arrogant speeches, and the golden child persona, my brother was absolutely terrified of me. He had looked at my blueprints, recognized a brilliance he could never authentically replicate, and panicked. His mockery was not born of superiority. It was born of deep, existential dread. "Sabrina, honestly, why are you lurking in the shadows like a frightened bat?" My mother's sharp voice shattered my realization. She was suddenly standing beside me, clutching a glass of Chardonnay, her diamonds catching the chandelier light. My father stood right behind her, adjusting his silk tie with an expression of mild exhaustion. "Look at your brother," my father said, gesturing grandly toward the center of the dance floor where Julian was spinning the wife of a state senator. "He is radiating success. He is the absolute pride of this family line. And yet, here you are, radiating nothing but misery. Your antisocial attitude is becoming a genuine embarrassment," my mother hissed, her manicured fingers gripping her wine glass tightly. "Can you not simply put on a pleasant face and be supportive for one evening? Must you always try to ruin the atmosphere with your jealousy?" I looked at my mother's meticulously preserved face, then at my father's stern, judgmental glare. They were completely blind. They had spent decades building a protective fortress of denial around their perfect son, willfully ignoring the monster growing inside it. In that precise fraction of a second, the heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligations simply dissolved. Any lingering trace of guilt or sisterly hesitation I possessed evaporated into the cold, air-conditioned air. They had made their choice long ago, and tonight, I was finally making mine. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I looked right through them as if they were made of glass. I raised my phone, my thumbs moving swiftly across the digital keyboard. I typed a single, decisive command to Mateo. Prepare to release the entire file. Tonight we change the order. I hit send, locking the screen. The hunt was officially over, and the execution was about to begin. The heavy mahogany doors of the club's private reading room clicked shut, instantly severing the lively jazz music and the suffocating chatter of the ballroom from our reality. The sudden silence was absolute, ringing in my ears like a physical weight. The air in this secluded space was stale, smelling faintly of aged leather, floor wax, and expensive scotch. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of a massive grandfather clock standing in the corner. Julian had followed me down the dim corridor with a look of mild amusement, clearly assuming I was finally dragging him away to surrender or beg for a position at his conglomerate. He leaned casually against a towering bookshelf, crossing his arms over his tailored chest. "If you are about to cry, please do it quickly," Julian said, his voice dripping with practiced boredom. "I have the mayor waiting to discuss my permit approvals, and I do not want to go back out there smelling like desperation." I did not speak. I simply walked over to the center of the room, pulled the phone from my clutch, and unlocked the screen. The encrypted file from Mateo was fully loaded, displaying the undeniable wire transfer logs and the recovered email chains. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the device onto the polished surface of the oak reading table. It slid across the wood and stopped exactly in front of him, the bright screen illuminating the dark space between us. "Take a look at your future," I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. Julian rolled his eyes, pushing himself off the bookshelf with a heavy sigh. He picked up the device, fully prepared to dismiss whatever he thought I was showing him. I watched him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. It happened in a fraction of a second. The smug, untouchable mask that Julian had worn his entire life finally cracked. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw locked so tightly I could hear the faint click of his teeth grinding together. For the very first time in 34 years, my brother looked genuinely, profoundly terrified. The silence in the room thickened, transforming from quiet into something dangerously claustrophobic. He stared at the digital evidence of his felony for a long time. Then, instead of crumbling, instead of offering a frantic apology or an excuse, the sheer narcissism embedded in his core took over. He slowly set the phone back on the table. The panic in his eyes hardened into a vicious, cornered rage. He dropped the golden child persona entirely, revealing the ruthless predator lurking underneath. "You think this actually means something?" Julian snarled, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. He stepped toward me, closing the distance until I could feel the heat radiating from his anger. "You think you have won because you found a single wire transfer? Grow up. Business is a bloody battlefield. It is a slaughterhouse. Your pathetic, bleeding heart softness does not deserve to exist in Seattle real estate. I did what was necessary to protect my territory. $50,000 is a rounding error, a standard operating fee to remove an annoying obstacle. The city does not care about your little moral victories. They will always protect the man who brings in the most money. You bribed a city official to sabotage my structural integrity reports because you were terrified of losing fairly," I stated, holding my ground, refusing to look away from his furious gaze. "You are not a king, Julian. You are just a frightened fraud." He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, his composure entirely shattered. "I am the one keeping this family relevant. I am the one building an empire while you play in the dirt." Before I could respond, the heavy brass handle of the reading room door turned, the heavy wood swung inward, and the muffled sound of the party briefly flooded the room before the door clicked shut again. Our father stood in the entryway. He looked irritated, holding an empty wine glass, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "What on earth are the two of you doing hiding in here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and authoritative. "Julian, the governor's chief of staff is asking for you. You are being incredibly rude to our guests." Julian immediately smoothed his expression, attempting to construct a hasty barricade over his panic. "We were just having a private debate about industry standards. Dad, nothing important." "It is actually incredibly important," I interrupted, my voice slicing through the heavy air. I picked up my phone from the oak table and walked directly over to my father. I held the glowing screen up to his face. "Your son did not just secure a massive real estate deal. He committed a federal crime. He paid a municipal clerk $50,000 to manipulate government documents and sabotage my firm. It is all right here. The transaction logs, the communications, everything." I watched my father's eyes scan the screen. I waited for the shock. I waited for the profound disappointment that any normal parent would feel upon discovering their child was a corrupt, calculating criminal. Instead, my father simply closed his eyes and let out a long, exhausted sigh. He did not look at Julian. He looked directly at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated anger. "Why must you always do this?" my father hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Why must you always try to destroy your brother's accomplishments? Are you so consumed by jealousy that you would manufacture a crisis tonight, of all nights on our anniversary?" "Manufacture," I repeated, a cold numbness spreading through my chest. "The evidence is right in front of you. He broke the law to ruin my career." "I do not care about your career," my father snapped, stepping closer, casting a tall, imposing shadow over me. "I care about this family's reputation. Do you have any idea what a scandal of this magnitude would do to our corporate shares? What it would do to your mother's social standing? You will delete whatever nonsense you have on that device immediately. You will walk out of that door. You will put a smile on your face, and you will keep your mouth shut. You will not ruin this night for him. Do you understand me?" It was a catastrophic, undeniable moment of clarity. The final, desperate illusion I had been clinging to simply shattered into a million irreparable pieces. As I looked at the angry, defensive posture of my father standing shoulder to shoulder with his corrupt son, I realized the absolute truth. This was never a home. This was a courtroom. And the verdict had been decided the day I was born. I was always destined to be the collateral damage required to maintain Julian's glorious facade. They would gladly watch me burn to the ground to keep him warm. All the anger, the hurt, and the desperate yearning for their approval instantly vanished. What replaced it was a void so cold and absolute, it felt like taking a breath of Arctic air. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly lowered my hand and slipped the phone back into the dark confines of my purse. I looked at my father, and then I looked at Julian. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face, a smile so devoid of humanity that I saw my brother involuntarily step back, a fresh wave of terror flashing across his eyes. "You are right, Julian," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, echoing sharply against the leather-bound books. "The strongest will win. Make sure to turn on the big screen at 9 o'clock tonight." It was exactly 10 minutes to 9 in the evening when I stepped back into the blinding, chaotic warmth of the grand ballroom. I retreated instantly to the farthest, darkest corner of the room. Leaning my back against the cool, fabric-lined wall, I became a ghost in my own family's house, perfectly still, waiting for the storm to make landfall. Julian burst through the heavy mahogany doors of the reading room just seconds later. His face was flushed, his chest heaving slightly under his tailored suit. The confrontation in the study had not humbled him. It had acted as a violent catalyst. His bruised ego, terrified by the crack in his perfect armor, desperately demanded immediate, overwhelming validation. He needed his audience. He needed his crown. Moving with frantic, aggressive energy, my brother marched directly across the polished parquet floor. He snapped his fingers sharply at the jazz band conductor, slicing his hand through the air in a cutting motion. The lively music stuttered and died in an awkward, discordant groan of brass and strings. The sudden silence in the massive hall was jarring. 200 elite guests paused mid-conversation, turning their heads in collective confusion. Julian did not care. He signaled to the venue's audiovisual technicians standing near the soundboard. "Bring down the main screen," Julian commanded, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room. "And patch the feed directly to the local news network. Turn the volume all the way up." A low murmur of curiosity rippled through the crowd of socialites and politicians. Above the grand marble fireplace, a massive cinematic projection screen slowly unrolled from the ceiling with a mechanical hum. Julian bounded onto the stage once more, grabbing the microphone with a white-knuckled grip. His eyes were wild with a manic, desperate arrogance. He was pushing all his chips to the center of the table, entirely convinced the game was rigged in his favor. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just one momentous occasion," Julian announced, his voice booming through the speakers, dripping with theatrical grandeur. "Tonight, we are celebrating 35 years of the Harper family legacy, but my father always taught me that a true legacy is not about looking backward, it is about conquering the future. In exactly 5 minutes, the mayor's office will hold a live press briefing to announce the winner of the largest municipal development contract in this city's history. I want you all to witness the exact moment my firm is awarded this monumental project. This is the project of the century. Tonight, we do not just celebrate history. Tonight, we claim the absolute future of Seattle." The ballroom erupted into a spontaneous round of applause. The sycophantic cheering washed over Julian, feeding his delusion. My parents abandoned their seats at the head table and practically sprinted to the stage, taking their places on either side of their golden son. My mother linked her arm through his, her face glowing with a pride so profound it looked almost feverish. My father patted Julian's shoulder, standing tall. Completely ignoring the devastating truth I had just handed him in the reading room, they were choosing the shiny, beautiful lie. I watched this tragicomedy unfold from the shadows. The sheer, suffocating dramatic irony of the moment pressed against my chest. Julian was actively assembling his own public execution, building the scaffold higher and higher, inviting the most powerful people in the state to watch him pull the lever. The digital clock on the audiovisual cart flashed 8:55. The giant screen flickered to life, displaying the bright, generic graphics of the local news channel. The anchor desk was empty. Instead, the camera was focused on the imposing granite steps of City Hall. A cluster of microphones bristled on a wooden podium. 8:57. The whispering in the ballroom faded into a tense, crackling anticipation. The guests shifted on their feet, their eyes glued to the massive projection. 8:59. Julian signaled to a waiter, snatching a fresh crystal flute of champagne from a passing silver tray. He held it casually against his chest, adjusting his posture to ensure he looked perfectly triumphant for the inevitable flood of congratulations. 9 o'clock. The screen shifted. A collective breath was drawn in the ballroom as a figure stepped up to the podium on the broadcast. It was not the mayor. It was Commissioner Victoria Vance. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit, her expression carved from absolute stone. There was no celebratory banner behind her, no smiling politicians waiting in the wings. The atmosphere of the press conference was entirely bleak and hostile. Julian's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but his ego quickly compensated. He raised his crystal glass high into the air, turning to the crowd with a knowing smirk, clearly assuming Vance was simply handling the preliminary, bureaucratic handover before his grand announcement. Commissioner Vance leaned into the microphones. Her voice cut through the ballroom speakers, sharp, clinical, and completely devastating. "Good evening," Vance stated, staring directly into the camera lens. Moments ago, the City Council concluded a rigorous, independent forensic audit regarding the upcoming municipal tech hub development. Following this audit, it is my duty to inform the public that we have uncovered evidence of severe systematic financial fraud and structural manipulation. The air in the country club vanished. The 200 guests stopped breathing. Vance did not pause. Effective immediately, the city officially and permanently rejects the bid submitted by the real estate conglomerate represented by Director of Development Julian Harper. The data provided by his department was entirely fabricated. Furthermore, due to credible evidence of bribery involving municipal officials, a full federal criminal investigation is being launched tonight. Arrest warrants are currently being processed. The broadcast continued, but the words became meaningless white noise. The luxurious golden ballroom plunged into a profound, deathly silence. It was a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure crushing the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy investors who had slapped Julian's back an hour ago stared at the screen in pure horror. On the stage, my parents looked as though they had been physically struck by lightning. My mother's hand slipped from Julian's arm, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. I looked at Julian. He was entirely frozen, a hollow statue of a man who had just watched his entire universe evaporate. His arm was still raised in the air, holding the celebratory glass of champagne. Then, a violent tremor seized his hand. The delicate crystal began to shake. The sharp, high-pitched clinking of ice hitting the sides of the glass echoed clearly through the dead. Suffocating silence of the ballroom. It was the only sound in the world, ringing out like a funeral bell over the absolute ruins of his empire. The heavy silence in the ballroom was finally broken, not by the guests, but by the colossal digital projection above the stage. For the first time since the broadcast began, the rigid lines of Commissioner Vance's face softened into a faint, respectful smile. However, Vance's amplified voice echoed, "The city of Seattle still requires a visionary path forward. Therefore, I am incredibly proud to announce that the $500 million municipal development contract has been officially awarded to Vanguard Horizon Designs, under the brilliant and exceptionally ethical leadership of principal architect Sabrina Harper." The collective whiplash in the room was almost physical. The suffocating tension snapped. Every single head in the grand hall swiveled simultaneously, their gaze abandoning the frozen, pathetic figure on the stage to search the shadows. The mocking smirks and pitying glances from an hour ago had completely vanished. In their place was a potent mixture of raw shock, sudden reverence, and palpable fear. 200 members of the city's elite stared at the dark corner of the room where I stood perfectly still against the wall. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic ringing shattered the quiet. It was coming from Julian's tailored pocket. Then, a second phone inside his jacket began to chime. Within seconds, his devices were erupting in a chaotic symphony of panic. It was the conglomerate's board of directors, the furious shareholders, and his frantic legal team. News of the federal investigation had hit the wire, and his corporate stock was currently in a catastrophic freefall in after-hours trading. The crystal champagne flute finally slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the polished wooden stage. The sound of breaking glass broke his paralysis, all of his calculated arrogance, his lifelong sense of supremacy, evaporated into pure, pathetic desperation. Julian stumbled down the stage stairs, clumsily shoving his way through the crowd of wealthy investors who immediately recoiled from him as if he were carrying a contagious disease. He sprinted toward me, his face glistening with cold sweat, his tie askew. He stopped inches away, practically collapsing, and reached out to desperately claw at my wrist. "Sabrina, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, breathless wheeze. "You have to call the press. You have to tell them we were secretly working together. Tell them it was a joint family venture. I will give you whatever you want. I will give you half my firm. You cannot let them send me to federal prison. Please, you have to save me." I looked down at his shaking, manicured hands gripping my sleeve. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but a cleansing, profound relief. I forcefully shoved his hands away. My voice was no longer the quiet whisper of a subjugated younger sister. It was clear, resonant, and loud enough for every single opportunist in the room to hear. "You used a microphone to say I would never be successful like you," I stated. staring directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. You were right. My success is not built on lies and fear like yours. Behind Julian, the crowd parted aggressively as my parents charged forward. Their faces were contorted in a mix of humiliation and irrational fury. "How dare you!" my mother shrieked, her voice shrill and trembling. "How could you intentionally destroy your own brother like this?" My father raised his hand, pointing an accusatory finger, opening his mouth to demand my submission one final time, but they never reached me. The silver-haired investors, the state politicians, and the powerful socialites who had laughed at Julian's cruel joke an hour earlier suddenly stepped forward. Moving as a unified, unspoken collective, they formed a solid, impenetrable human wall between my family and me. They turned their backs on my screaming parents and my sobbing brother, completely isolating them. The elite society of Seattle had instantly recognized the new apex predator in the room. By physically shielding me, they were silently, permanently excommunicating the Harper family from their world. Exactly 6 months later, the suffocating memory of that ballroom felt like a lifetime away. I stood on the open-air rooftop of the very first eco tower currently under construction in the heart of downtown Seattle. The crisp, salty wind off the bay whipped through my hair, and the brilliant afternoon sunlight warmed the heavy steel beams surrounding me. Down below, in a completely different reality, Julian had been unceremoniously fired from his conglomerate. He was currently out on bail, awaiting a massive federal trial, and had been permanently stripped of his architectural and development licenses. His carefully constructed empire was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Leaning against the railing, looking out over the sprawling city skyline that I was now reshaping, I finally understood the true nature of victory. The most perfect revenge is never about screaming at your abusers or forcing them to apologize. True, absolute revenge is simply moving forward and permanently revoking their right to ever stand on the same level as you again. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's story and want to support the channel, please consider helping us with just $1 by scanning the donation QR code on your screen or using the donation link in the description and pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them provide for their families and continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you for your time, and stay strong.